write
You also write.
psychology textbooks for college students.
Yeah, but that wasn't on the list. How come we need to get some of the textbooks on there? Anyway, so welcome, Dr. Robin Rosenberg. It is great to have you. Yeah, we're here to talk about the psychology of superheroes. So why tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I got interested in this. I have three sons, so just an FYI about that. And in their preschool, the X-Men were very popular, and I was not familiar with the X-Men. They were after my time. So we watched the Saturday morning cartoons so I could understand them with them. We watched them, and I was like, wow, there is so much psychology here. It was amazing. And so if also, can you take off the
Yes.
yes, thank you. So I could see people instead of little thumbnails. So I was really blown away, and I had this idea to write a book about psychology using superheroes as illustrative material. And I was working on writing an intro psych textbook at the time, which is, of course, why my mind went there. And I was invited by a publisher. They were about to have this book, The Psychology of Superheroes. They were looking for an editor to put it together. And they wanted to know if I could contribute. And I said, oh, can I be the editor? And that would be my version. So that's kind of how I got into the superhero world. And it actually is broader than that. It's using other people's fiction to illustrate scientific psychology. So I've been involved in a book on the psychology of Harry Potter, where I talked about how to use the science, what students learn at Hogwarts, and why the scientific method is important, and why they need muggles, to people like Harry to come into their world and not just have this whole inbred. Anyway, so you could see where I'm going with this. The girl with the dragon tattoo, what do we know about memory and how accurate is it? And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. I do executive coaching. I have a psychotherapy practice, but I also just find people fascinating. So before I begin, I want to tell you a story, and I think there's a visual angle to it. So I know if you work individually with people, you tend to focus on the superhero, right? Like using the metaphor and their powers and abilities. And there's a typical story arc about superheroes and their origins, which is, they either have their power, they were born with their powers, they discover their powers later or get their powers later in life, like Superman, or it's kind of random at chance, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It's kind of random. Or you're born with them, like, Wonder Woman, Superman, all these people. So, and then once they have enough cognitive power, the arc is where they challenge themselves to understand their power, right? What are its limits? How can you use it? Where should you not use it? And the example is that in the first, episode 4 of Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie, but episode 4, for those of you, show of hands, who's seen that movie? The original. Great. Okay. So there's this scene with Luke training blindfolded with the lightsaber, right? And Obi-Wan is behind him. And so with the little ball that floats in the air. And that's the classic arc of, I have this power. How can I use it? Right. So then they sort of learn about their power with Spider-Man. It's, he starts out basically using his powers for teenage purposes, not necessarily for good, if you will, because it's fun and he can. And then at some point they have to decide, so how do I use my powers? To what end? To what purpose? What meaning do I make of my powers? And so that's the sort of classic story arc, but I think it's also true in real life. We have all of these stories of people who have overcome adversity of some kind or another, and then dedicate themselves to helping others in some connected and meaningful way, right? So the first thing is they discover they have this power with this adversity, and we can have a whole conversation about adversity, and there's a beautiful body of research on what an area called post-traumatic growth, and the way sort of stress and trauma induce growth. And most people who experience the trauma don't get PTSD, FYI. Statistically, you would never know that from fiction, right? Where was I? So anyway, back to the superheroes and the story arc. But in real life, people have horrible things happen to them. They make meaning of them. They learn something about themselves, right? They discover their superpower, and then they decide how they want to use it. And some people use it for nefarious ends. We see evidence of this daily, but other people, want to give back in some way. Okay, so that's the individual story of the superhero. If you focus just on the hero, right? And they have some vulnerability and have to manage that in some way. If you're facilitating a group, I think the more interesting question is the superhero in context. And so I want to tell you about my favorite. He's not my favorite superhero, but he's my favorite story of a superhero. And it is Green Arrow. And if you're interested, it's actually in a graphic novel called Year One by Andy Diggle. So Green Arrow is a DC character, and he's basically Batman with a slightly different context. So he's blonde, but he's rich. His parents died when he was young, non-traumatically, but he's rich. He was left with all of this money, and he has what's called a sensation-seeking temperament. You may not be familiar with it. It's sometimes called a novelty-seeking temperament. It is sometimes associated with ADHD. And these are people who typically engage in highly stimulating activities. So they may be traders, right? They may be emergency room physicians. They engage in downhill skiing, speed racing, that kind of thing. And their central nervous system requires more stimulation to feel in its just right place. Right. So, and then you have the opposite with people who are low sensation seekers, and they don't need much stimulation to be in their just right place. And most of us are in the middle, right? Because it's a bell curve, like most personality and temperament characteristics. Okay. So I'm giving you a lot of psychology embedded in this whole superhero thing here. So this character, he's rich and he has a mega sensation-seeking temperament. So he'll hire a helicopter to drop him on a pristine mountain so he can ski down. But he also is an asshole because he makes his admin do it with him, right? Like the admin is not a high sensation seeker. He drinks and drugs a lot and throws money around and really high stim for no purpose, right? No meaning. It's just to satisfy his central nervous system, but there's no ulterior motive. He's really a layabout, if you will. So then what happens is he's on his yacht and they're caught in some storm, and he's the only survivor. He's shipwrecked on an island. And for the first time in his life, he has to earn his own keep. So he has to fish, he has to spear fish, and he makes a bow and an arrow, and he starts, he forages, all this stuff. And he loves it. He's happy because he's directly earning his keep. He's doing something meaningful and purposeful. It's still high stim, right? I mean, his life is at risk every day. So, but it's all context. And then the really big thing is he's foraging on the island. And long story short, on the other side of the island, there are people doing like a meth lab or something that he didn't know existed, and someone's in danger, and he helps the person in danger. And he feels so good. He feels so good about being helpful and using his skills. And he loves the risk, right? Because he's a sensation seeker. He just loves that. And so when he goes home and he's rescued, this is what he does. He dedicates his life to helping other people in risky situations, right? In dangerous situations. So I'm telling this story because it's really about context. Because he's the same person with the same set of skills, abilities, and vulnerabilities. But you change the context and like, boom, it's a superpower. What was a drag, what was problematic becomes a superpower, right? So all his drugging and, dropping himself off mountains and making other people do it with him. This was a problem. So I just love that story because it's really about context.
Mhm.
And so, in groups determine an individual's context, right? And so someone can be great in one context and put them in another, and they're not so great, or vice versa, because is there social facilitation that happens, or is it a kind of a drain, and you're subtracting from them? So that's why I wanted to start out telling that story, and the importance of a good facilitator, right, is where it uplifts everybody. And so if you ask people to draw themselves as a superhero, I think it's an additional item on your list is to ask them to draw their context,
Mm.
or multiple contexts, the context in which they flourish, right, and the context that are challenges, right, where there's kryptonite, or whatever you want to frame it.
Yeah.
Because I think too often the context gets lost.
Yeah. Thank you for that. One of the things that's coming up for me is, especially on the topic of context, is that anytime somebody comes into a facilitation with us, usually since we're external facilitators, they've never been in this social context before.
Right.
And so they are checking to us to say, okay, well, what's okay? What's not okay? Do I behave like I'm in church, or do I behave like I'm in a locker room? What is the correct social container for this thing? Um, and you know, one of the things that I've heard and I really believe in is that smart people don't necessarily make smart groups. And sometimes people will show up as less than their best selves in a group context because all of a sudden they have a audience, and they have the tendency to grandstand or get on their soapbox or say, well, finally, now people will listen to me. And it's almost like we've made it too safe for them, right? So,
Mhm.
in terms of context, what recommendations might you have in terms of the way that we can set up the space so that it can be safe for people to be their authentic selves, to say what's on their mind, and at the same time, make it so safe that they are their whole selves, and I don't mean that in a good way, right? Sometimes like, okay, show up
Right.
as your whole self. It's like, well, wait a minute. I didn't mean like not that whole.
So great question. And I have a little thing that I like to say, which is you don't want to bring your whole self. You don't want people to
Mhm.
bring their whole selves to work or to a group. And so I even their authentic self, which is how do you distinguish that from a whole self? I think that we actually um, privilege authenticity at
Mhm.
the cost of potentially at the cost of respect, mutual respect. So I think for me, it is absolutely about the container. And you're so right. I mean, I have so much respect for the work that you do because you're coming in blind. Everyone's coming in blind, but you're leading the blind. You are blind in the sense that you don't know these people, right? You don't know who the challenging people are. And so where everybody's blind, but you have to lead them. So, but I think the issue of so I actually wouldn't even call it a safe container. I mean, I'm being really quite oppositional uh,
Mhm.
with language here. I think it's about a respectful container,
Mhm.
right? Because I think that's the idea, which is people can disagree, but they should do it respectfully. Like that's the presumption,
Right.
which is we want to hear what each of you thinks and that you're willing to share, and we hope you're willing to share because you will be treated respectfully by all the rest of us.
Mhm.
So for me, the word choice is really important to emphasize civility and respect, and less so on safety, because safety fundamentally comes if people are respectful.
Mhm.
I mean, that's really underneath all of it. And safety otherwise is really complicated of what's safe, what's not safe. It's like, if you will treat me respectfully, then I can share more because you're not going to slam me and you're not going to, obviously there's the whole social media afterwards piece, right? But if it's the idea is respect, we can all disagree. We can have strong feelings and express them respectfully. And if you can't if you cannot express what you want to say respectfully, please don't say it.
Hmm.
I mean, you know,
Yeah, I love that. Framing it in terms of respect. Yeah, thank you. Marilyn has a question for you in chat. How do you give feedback to someone who is taking advantage of the safe space to also be uncouth? And somehow that can show up the way that that shows up is, well, you said that this is safe. I'm just saying what's on my mind, but they're not
right.
being respectful.
It's wonderful. So this is why I don't think safety is the great word, or
Hmm.
authenticity, or whole self, or I think those are really provocative words. And people, are people familiar with radical honesty, that concept?
Radical candor. Yeah, sure.
Radical candor, yeah. And so what ends up happening in many contexts, the pitfall of that was only the bosses could be radically candid. And there are people who, they see safety and it's an opportunity for them to just mouth off. So that's why I mean, it's a great question. And I think that's why you shouldn't say that. You should say respect,
Mhm.
and actually give a little bit of a definition, right? Because again, if you don't define it, people will have their own definition, right? It's that we can disagree. You don't leap down each other's throat. The goal is to hear and be heard, right? And then ask questions, right? To come in with curiosity about other people's perspectives, what they're bringing, what they're coming from, what they're seeing that you may not see. To bring that curiosity to the listening, even when you know that you don't agree,
I love
because
that. Thank you.
probably something there.
Um, Going back to superheroes, and by the way, Rebecca said in chat, people use radical candor as an excuse to be mean. I'm saying what you were saying. Going back to the idea of superheroes for a second, how are you able to weave superheroes into your work with patients in your work as a therapist?
So one of the things about being a therapist or a coach is not to impose your own stuff.
Yeah.
So, so I might, not everyone likes superheroes. It was shocking to me, but not true nonetheless. It's about finding metaphors and analogies that really work for the other person.
Hmm.
It's hard to grow up without knowing about Superman. So, that's kind of a go-to, or when Wonder Woman movies come out, or, Spider-Man movies come out. Um, I will tell the story of Green Arrow to people. He's not a well-known, he didn't used to be, there's a CW TV show about him. But he didn't used to be well-known unless you were really into comics. But I will talk about him where it's very clear what the moral of the story is. So I think if you have, you could use anything. I mean, sometimes I'll use Pride and Prejudice,
Mm.
it's really, as long as you're clear about what you want people to get out of it versus assume that they'll get it.
Hmm.
This is again about clarity and communication. Um, so when I use superheroes in that way, I mean, most people, it's fine even if they don't like superheroes, because they understand where I'm coming from and why I'm using that
Yeah.
story.
To your comment about sometimes how we're the blind leading the blind. Well, you're not wrong, and I think those of us that dabble with the visual side of things, it can make things a little bit more concrete. That we take things that are very abstract and tough to get your hands around, and we say, well, let's represent it this way. And all of a sudden, the dynamic becomes about the image that we've created, and not so much about, oh, I don't like what Bob said across the table. Um, as a shorthand, I dabble a little bit in the idea of archetypes, and there's all kinds of different archetypes out there, whether it's Enneagram, DISC, Myers-Briggs, Jungian archetypes, whatever, as a shorthand of saying, I see this personality type. I kind of understand where this person is coming from. I understand how they make decisions. Um, I wonder if superheroes, if you see some of the same archetypes in superheroes, and if there's overlap with different personality types. Here's my Lex Luthor, right? Here's my Batman. Is there a way of like maybe using that to just say, okay, I understand how these people bring in information and make decisions as a shorthand for, how do I speak to them in a way that resonates?
Yes, and you have to, if you're going to use that so it's one thing if you do it in your own head,
Oh
right?
yeah,
Like, oh, this is the archetype of who I think this person is and how I
right.
can be helpful here.
Hmm.
But if you're going to share it, especially in a group, that gets really complicated because then some people won't know who it is, and you have to take the time to explain it,
Yeah.
and the person
Mhm.
may feel insulted. And so I think it's for your own heuristic of, how do I deal with this person? And
Mhm.
it may be an archetype of someone else, who was in a previous facilitation group, and you have that pegged now. Like that's your archetype of that original person. I think it becomes complicated to share unless the intent is to have it be a learning moment.
Mhm.
Um, so two things that I wanted to go back to. One is about making it visual. So there's a very interesting in the very old psychoanalytic psychotherapy literature about how when a patient is talking and the therapist, the analyst kind of starts riffing in their own head about and so that process. And so what you're describing when you go visual,
Mhm.
right, you're having that analogous experience about what's coming up from the group and the associations that you're making to that, and then creating the visual around that. So it's really interesting. It's a phenomenon, it's a well-known phenomenon.
Mhm.
That the beauty of it is figuring out, no, this is my stuff, versus no, this feels like it's really energetically coming from the group.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the art of being a good facilitator or therapist or anything.
To your point, so occasionally, the whole industry of us will get together about once a year at an event called IFVP. And one of the coolest moments that I ever saw at one of those conferences was there was a panel of speakers that was talking about something. I don't. It's not even important what it was, but at the same time, there were about 12 people around them that were all visualizing what they heard. And the cool thing about it is that not one of those different visualizations looked anything like the other. They were all going through the synthetic process of synthesizing and, encoding of what was important to them, and then further translating it stylistically in a vernacular that they themselves had created. And so, yeah, Rachel remembers that too. And so, what was really cool about it is, to me, is that was listening made visible, right? It was
Mhm.
made concrete. I'd be interested in learning a little bit more about that. Maybe you call it empathizing. I don't know if there's a good word for it, but like, what's a way of understanding a little bit more about that process?
So I think that I don't there's not a lot written about, there would not have been in the
Hmm.
analytic literature about the mechanism because that's not really what they were into. But if anyone here plays music with other people, there's a similar invisible thing that happens. You start and stop together, even if you're not looking at each other. Even if you've never played with these people before, something that happens in the between, um, that it can be very deep and profound in the moment, and where it's like you have antenna, and you're picking up something and it gets translated internally. So it's not the exact same message, right? But it's getting translated in the air and landing on you and then evoking something in you, but thematically is related. So
Hmm.
I'd be curious, when the 12 people had different visualizations, was there some common theme?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm actually, if you happen to remember, right? Like, was there something being transmitted, and wow, we all experience that somewhat differently, but there's some commonality there.
Gosh, Rachel, how long ago was that? Was that 2018, 2016?
Oh, too long ago.
No, that was
Okay,
in Austin. That was in 2016.
2016 then. Yeah.
Too long ago. Okay. But I would be I mean, you could even do little experiments, right?
That
About
would be
this,
fun.
if what the common theme is. And there's one other point I wanted to make.
Yeah,
Sorry,
please.
going back to personality. So the research on personality is really interesting, and context comes up here as well. So each of us, there are zillions of personality traits and temperaments, right? And then the big five or some other version has them kind of lumped together in thematic ways. But it turns out we all differ in what are called central traits, which are the traits that are most enduring for us. So I may have 7 personality traits that are most likely to be consistent across situations, but each of us may have a different set of 7 out of 500, right? And so what happens for the rest of them, the non-central traits, is very context dependent. And so those are the traits that will vary, not so much, they won't be consistent across settings, they'll be very situation based. So when people come into a new facilitation, they've never done it before, you're leading it. People for whom a central trait is let's say, following the rules, conscientiousness, we might say, those people are probably fairly consistently conscientious across situations, because in the absence of any cues in the context, in the environment, right, they're going to impose their own. The things that are most important to them are what are going to come up in the situation. People for whom conscientiousness is in the middle, they're not going to be so worried about the rules and sort of what's okay and what's not okay. And then, for the narcissists, of course, that's really important to them, and that's going to be consistent across it. So it's interesting, even with personality traits, what you're seeing in the context, in your context, may or may not be an enduring personality trait, but something that's comes up in this situation. I just wanted to.
No, I think that I've heard something similar to that. That there's so I don't know if you can see what I've got here, but this is a little switch box, and these things are called momentary switches. Okay, and so a momentary switch, it's like the same thing as what we used to have in the ignitions of our car. And so if you wanted to turn on the ignition, you had to throw the switch, right? But as soon as you took your finger off of it, it snaps back into place. And so what I'm hearing you say is that it's almost like we have different personality traits, and some of them may be a little bit more contextual and easy to throw, while other ones, they're kind of stuck and they're sort of rusted in place and they're a little bit more rigid. Have I kind of got that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say they're always on. Is
Always
what
on.
I would.
Okay.
There are some personality traits that are pretty, much more frequently on, and it would take a lot to switch them. So they're, and then others, they just get switched depending on the moment, and what's happening in context. I love that. That's really good. Does that work, or is that? No, is that, do the switches work, or it's just illustrative?
I mean, it got the message across, so yes, it did.
Right. Really cool.
So I wanna open it up to others. But while y'all are thinking, Robin, just thinking about the work that we do, we love doing things like energizers. We love doing things like activities. We love asking check-in questions. In fact, Rachel is like, she's our check-in guru. She's got amazing check-ins. She asks great questions. What's one that we could ask that kind of delves into the area of superheroes that might give us a lens onto who's in the room?
So there are different ways. I'm going to throw out variants.
Okay.
One is what people think their superpower is and what
Mhm.
their vulnerability is.
Mhm.
Okay. Another one is what their superpower is and the context in which it functions best and the context in which it functions worst,
Oh, cool.
which is that's the green arrow question, right?
Mhm.
What I mean, if you want to get visual, what the sigil is that they would put on their chest, so it's prototypical superheroes have, the S or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And so what is it that is theirs and what's the meaning of it? Right. So there are people who do workshops about people creating their own, drawing their own costume.
Mhm.
their own sigil and the colors and what it means and all of that. You know, you can ask people if they view themselves as a superhero, a supervillain, or an anti-hero.
Mm.
So for instance, Batman has a nemesis, Poison Ivy, played by Uma Thurman in one of the Batman movies long ago. And she is really, so she's interesting. This actually gets quite political, and I don't think you want to go there, but basically, you know, as she's an eco-terrorist, but she views herself as a hero,
Mhm.
right? So she is in her world, she is a superhero because she is saving plants and, you know, human beings are the bane of the existence of plants or animal, you know, and whatever, right? You get the point. So she's a hero. We see her as a villain. And so you can, when people answer that question, you can ask them, what is it that they're saving? Like, what is it? In what ways are they being heroic? So you also have super and hero, right? Or super and villain. And so you can ask people to separate these, right? Which is what's their power, or, you know, a power. And then how do they use it? To what end do they use it? To what end do they want to? You can do aspirational, you can do actually, you know, how do they actually use the power? Do they not use it? What is their, you know, to what, you know, to what nefarious end do they use it? So I think there are a bunch of different ways. I think the heroic part is really interesting. I think for introverts, for people who are quiet, it's a really interesting question because you can think of them as the people who are behind the scenes working the computer. You know, in modern hero stories, there's always some really spiffy computer nerd, right? Of either male or female, and who is at the back end of making the super company work, so to speak, right? And so it's also a really interesting question about, do people see themselves as the sidekick or the person out front, right? Because there are many ways to be a hero, right? But so another interesting way of getting a sense of who people are is, or who are they in the band, right? You know, are they the bass player? Are they the drummer? Are they the lead singer? Are they, you know, it's the same context of, or same question of how do you show up in a group,
Mhm.
right? And so if you're part of a team, if you're the X-Men, right? Are you Professor X? Are you a leader? Are you a follower? Which, you know, we need followers. Followers are kind of have a bad rap and rep in our country. But in many countries, they are absolutely seen as vital and treated as such. So these are all, you know, sidekick versus the person out front.
Mhm.
Yeah. Did I answer that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. All right, let me open it up to others. While you're coming off mute, I get to sneak one more in. I'm fascinated by the whole alter ego dynamic that you
Ah,
see with superhero. All right, yeah, so kind of geek out psychologically with me. What's going on there?
so we all have different selves. So this gets back to the personality and context piece, right? Because we have all these different traits inside of us, different temperaments, and have different learning histories about how much we have to control ourselves, right? This gets back to the, you know, the people who just view it as a safe space, they can do whatever they want, right? And so we are multitudes. Each of us is multitudes. I mean, I think it's a cute way of illustrating how we can be different in different contexts, and they're all parts of us. So, you know, Superman I mean, I'm going to talk about him as if he were a real person right now. I know he's not real. But he will sometimes talk lovingly about being Clark Kent, right? Because he gets to not have to be super, right? He gets to fumble, he gets to be brainy, because people don't view Superman as brainy. He's really smart. He gets to be something else. If you go to Comic-Cons and you talk to people who are wearing costumes, which I have done, and have done some research on costume and mask wearing, which is a whole other interesting thing. But what's fascinating is many people who wear costumes are introverts. The people who walk the exhibit floors and are always on the nightly news, they're introverts. And they do this as a way to like get this other parts of them that are inside that are hard to come out to come out.
Mhm.
And typically there's some meaning in whatever character that they're dressed up as. And one person that I interviewed told me how, he's very mild-mannered and introverted, not one to toot his own horn. And he was at a job interview and they asked him questions and he knew he had to toot his own horn, right, in order to get the job. But it was hard for him. And so he, it's one of these life imitating art, imitating life. He said, well, what would hit the superhero that he dresses as do in this situation? And he literally channeled his superhero to allow him to do what he needed to do in the interview. But of course, this is recursive because it was him in his costume. It's still him, but he can't otherwise get in touch with that him, right? Like he had to superhero it up in order to get in touch with that part of him. So I don't know that answered your
No,
question.
I have like 200 more, but I'm going to hold back. So I saw Laura go off mute. So Laura, what's coming up for you?
So much. Oh my God, I absolutely love this. Thank you so much. This is amazing. For me, I'll go with the two sides, right? So I persevere, but I also perseverate. And so sometimes that's my superpower, and sometimes it is my kryptonite. And it really does depend on the situation that I'm in. And then I'll just tell a fun story about how I've channeled a superhero for myself. I'm a mental health clinician. I was working overnights in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, which if you don't know, has a lot of nefarious things going on. And I was young, right? And so, I put on my Buffy boots. That's what I called it. And I called myself the mental health slayer, out at midnight, all night long in the emergency room, slaying mental health at the time because I was younger. And then recently with COVID, I was working in an emergency room, again, doing crisis work in Southern New Hampshire. And of course, they're all saying, oh, our superheroes, our superheroes. Well, I took it one step further because I don't know, I was in the middle of it all, right? How can you not be worried about, COVID at that time? And instead of jeans Friday, sorry about my dogs. Instead of Jean Friday, I instituted Superhero Friday, and I would just wear like underoos, but like underneath my sweater. But I would flash the doctors or the radiologist or the IT people thought that was fabulous. What a great idea! Instead of Jean Friday, how boring that is. Superheroes all the way. Yeah. So, anyways, that's my story.
That's
Thank you,
great.
Laura.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm not a sports guy. I get really tired of, oh, we're going to wear sports jerseys on Friday. I'm like, God, I have to go pick that. I have to pretend that I like sports now. Yeah, maybe this should be like a superhero
Or
Friday
choose
or
your own
something.
costume,
Choose your
right?
own costume. That's even better. Speaking of which, I did hear you say very quietly that you also cosplayed. Maybe I didn't catch that. You said you studied them.
I did.
You studied. You didn't like show up at a Comic-Con like also geared
No,
up.
my co-author of the studies does cosplay,
Okay.
but I don't.
I
No.
know you've thought about it. If you were going to cosplay, who would you cosplay as? I know you've thought about it.
I actually haven't thought about it.
I don't believe that
I,
I don't believe it
I,
at all. How can you write a
I
book on cosplaying and not think about it?
so I read Pride and Prejudice once a year, and I
Okay,
watch
now we're talking.
the Jane Ellie and Colin Firth version once a year. So I want to say cosplay as Lizzie Bennet, but
Nice. All
not a
right.
choice.
No, we'll take it. We'll take it. That works.
Yeah.
It's like 200 other questions about cosplay with you right now, but I'll save it.
Okay.
Others, I'm curious as to what's coming up for you. You know, questions you'd like to ask. Yeah, Andrea, what's going on?
What's your take on superhero poses?
Ooh.
Oh, so that's really interesting. So is anyone not familiar? And I can do a brief. Okay. Do you want to give a brief overview because you asked the question, Andrea?
I don't know that that I necessarily have a big overview, but people they'll get confidence from using superhero poses. Um, it's a confidence thing. Yeah, like Rachel's demonstrating the superhero, hands on the hips
Yeah.
Right.
pose that actually does, has that effect of increasing your confidence or increasing your
Yeah.
investment.
Yeah. So that's a great question. There was research on this topic that made it a thing. Like, oh, it became a recommendation is to strike the superhero pose, hands on hips. And that research didn't replicate.
Hmm.
And so it was the original research, and it didn't replicate. That's not to say that if you believe that there isn't a placebo effect, right? So there's a difference between it actually doing something neurologically, regardless of whether you believe it or not, right? Versus if you believe it, it'll be helpful. So the original research didn't pan out that it in and of itself, it's helpful. But I think that if people believe it, that it'll be helpful. It's helpful as a placebo. I mean, it's so part of our consciousness, that Superman, Wonder Woman stance.
Hmm.
Um, I don't, so there's a lot of research about mental simulation in sports. So mentally simulating practicing something is really almost as good as actually doing it. So when people walk a golf course, golfers, and then they imagine the drive, or basketball players, or when they imagine things that they know that they need to work on, huge amount of data about mental practice. I think that people don't have to actually do the stance. I think it's the same idea, and the same thing the mild-mannered guy was talking about in his interview, which is if you mentally practice, you get the same benefit. So I think it's really, I will send to patients or coachees, there's a clip online from Superman 1 where Superman just flew Lois Lane around, and he doesn't yet have a name, and he drops her off on her patio, and she's like, what is Superman? And so that, hence how she refers to him in the news. But her doorbell rings, and it's Clark Kent. And he's, Lois, I don't know, we were supposed to go out to dinner. I'm sorry, I'm late. And she'd forgotten. But there's literally, it's 30 seconds where he does this posture thing, right? Not the hips, but he just stands up tall. He lowers his voice, and he talks to her in the Superman voice because he's about to tell her who he is. And then she comes out all kind of ditzy, and he goes back. And I send this to people about how powerful it is a really amazingly powerful illustration of at least pretending that you have self-esteem.
Hmm.
And that even pretending is a practice, right? That it is a practice. And so I think there's a lot of value in that to answer that posture question.
So to your point about like just pretending and that transition and transformation, I think that, one of the things that's a thread throughout superhero stories is the idea of transformation. And you
Right.
brought up Superman and Wonder Woman, who to me are like the least interesting superheroes, right? Because there's no transformation with them, right? There is no Uncle Ben moment like what, Spider-Man has. There's no crime alley like with Batman. And so I'm kind of wondering, just if you don't mind revealing a little bit, who are your favorite superheroes and why do you like them?
So the story of Green Arrow is my favorite
Hmm.
because it's a story of transformation. it's transformation for meaning and purpose. The power of meaning and purpose and transformation. I actually think that there is this is my own interpretation of Wonder Woman's origin story. There is a transformation where she is by far the strongest, smartest person on her island, on Amazonia. And can you imagine how boring that must be?
Yes. Yeah.
Unbelievably boring. And so her transformation is in meeting Steve Trevor, and oh my God, I can get off this island. There's something else out there. There are men. That's new. That's interesting. That stimulates. So I actually think there is a transformation as part of her story, which is just get me out of here. And I want something new and new challenges and new people and things that are unpredictable.
Gotcha.
As an aside, I actually like Superman's story. I actually think it is a story of transformation. It's a story about his having to have been hidden for a long time as growing up because he was super all along, and about how to be known. I mean, his dual identity is really how to be known, all sides of him, right? How to be seen and appreciated for all his different facets. So that's a whole other issue. I mean, Batman is the poster boy for the area of research called post-traumatic growth. It's a great story. I'm mostly about the origin stories, not so much the character themselves. Right. But the idea, he is literally the story about making meaning from adversity.
Yeah.
He's 1941 or something, 1939 was that story. It was in 2 pages, the origin story, but making what happened to him and how he made meaning. So Buffy the Vampire Slayer is another interesting one because she had no choice. It was destiny. And shit happens. And how do we meet the circumstances? What kind of spirit, with what spirit do we take on the challenge when we don't have a choice? So I mean, I think I have different favorites for different things.
Okay. All right. Valid. You had already talked about Poison Ivy a little bit as an anti-hero, but Laura was asking if you had any additional thoughts about anti-heroes as a dynamic, as a personality type.
Yeah, so I actually was thinking about this in terms of groups. So I have a little bit of the oppositional in me. So I typically in a group setting will take the other side just because I do. And also to poke holes in the argument to strengthen it. I mean, it's not just to be it's not to be obnoxious, but it's really to like, okay, let's look at that solution and see if we can improve it and find the vulnerabilities, right? And strengthen it. So I think that in groups, there are anti-heroes who are really important and serve a purpose. That it's anti and hero. They're not actually anti-heroes. They're heroes that kind of do it a little differently, kind of outside the margins, so to speak. And so, some people say Batman is an anti-hero, right? Because he's outside the law and, doesn't always play by the rules. So I think there's, in the same way of having respect for followers, it's about having respect for respectful anti-heroes, right? This word respect comes up again, because if they serve a really important purpose of kind of challenging aspects of the status quo. I think when you get to eco-terrorism, it's much more complicated, right? Because she has no compunction about killing humans. But I think the idea of questioning, right, of questioning conventional wisdom has a really useful place and is often underappreciated, at least by some managers.
Thank you. I want to give our folks just another chance to weigh in. If you want to come off mute, ask one last question. I think we've got time for maybe one more before we call it a night.
And it can be about psychology. It doesn't have to be superheroes.
I have a question about superheroes and like using that method for I can't remember what the word is. For creating a connection with like your audience. Do you recommend using, like, for me, for example, like I'm not super into superheroes. I know like just enough to scratch the surface and that's about it. Do you think it's a good idea for me or anyone in my position to use superheroes as a method to connecting with an audience, or do you recommend like really having a deep understanding before going into that?
I think it depends on your audience. I mean, if your audience is people who don't like superheroes, then why? Right? Like maybe you should talk about Pride and Prejudice, you know. So I mean, this is always the challenge about who trying to figure out who your audience is. I think it's fine to if it's right for your audience or the point that you want to make. It doesn't have to be your like if there's a point that you want to make based on your knowledge, you can say, I'm not a superhero fan. I don't know a lot, but I want to use this to illustrate the point that I want to make here. I think that's your safest bet, because any superhero character that's been around more than 5 years has a zillion different origin stories and arcs. And like Green Arrow, there's a lot of different origin stories, right? So it's like this version is the one I want to talk about to illustrate a point. So I think you're fine as long as you're clear about why you're using it and you're not claiming to.
Right. To be an expert.
I mean, you could use Star Wars, right? You could have seen a Star Wars movie and that's all you know, but you can talk about Luke Skywalker or Princess Leia or, you know, Han Solo to make a point, because it's in the air and people should know something
Like
about
pop culture.
pop
Yeah,
culture.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Great questions. Find the fiction that gets you juiced. Yeah. I think fiction, honestly, in this day and age, I think fiction is much better than using any real examples, because
That's a really good point.
it can be
A lot
polarizing.
safer.
A lot safer. It's really people cannot like the example, but I think it's just.
And truth is stranger than fiction these days. All right, so let's give Dr. Rosenberg a Nova Scribes. Thank you. Yay, it's great having you.
Thank you. It was great questions, really great. I have such respect for the work that you do. It is so challenging. And as I say, that being willing to put yourselves on the line in that way, to be among the blind, but leading, you know, you are obviously risk takers, have some sensation seekers in you.
That usually works. Okay, here's the stop button. Hang on a second. There it is.